Till Svenska Lottakårens frukostseminarium som idag ska handla om Sverige i FNs säkerhetsråd. Välkomna till er som tittar på webben också, ska jag säga. Dagens lilla seminarium kommer att hållas av Molly Brander från Svenska FN-förbundet. Så välkommen Molly.
Tack så mycket. Jag fick frågan nu ifall jag skulle kunna hålla den här föreläsningen på engelska. Så jag undrar hur alla känner för det. Är det någon som inte vill att det ska vara på engelska? Känns det okej? Ja, okej. Men i sådana fall, then I'm going to do this in English. You'll have to excuse me. At some points I might have to take a moment to remember what a word is, because all my notes are in Swedish. So I'll start. I'm going to talk about Sweden in the in UN Security Council. My name is Molly Brander, and I work as a desk officer for peace and security at the UN Association of Sweden. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what the Security Council is and how it's set up, with the permanent and the elected members. And then I'm going to go into more about what Sweden has done in the Security Council, and I'm going to finish with saying what we at the UN Association of Sweden think about Sweden's work in the Security Council. So I will just go ahead here. So the Security Council, their first, the most important thing that the Security Council work with is to keep international peace and security in the world. So that's their main issue. And we have the UN rule book, so to say, and that in there, they don't speak about what is like an issue for peace and security, what is a specific international security threat. There's no definition of what that is. So that's something that the Security Council themselves have to decide. For example, there's geographical questions. We have Syria, that's a security threat. And then there's thematic questions, which could, for example, be children in armed conflict. So the Security Council is built up with 15 members. We've got the 5 permanent members, which we can call P5 for short. And we've got 10 elected members, the E10. So Sweden is currently sitting as one of the elected 10 members, which is elected for 2 years, 2-year periods. So Sweden has been sitting for almost 2 years now. They finish their term at New Year's. And then Belgium and Germany is going to take over as the two Western countries. So that's also one of the parts about the elected 10 members. They are divided into different geographical areas. So we've got 3 African countries, 2 Asian, 2 Latin American, 1 Eastern European, and 2 Western European. So Sweden has been sitting as a Western European together with Holland and the Netherlands and Italy. And I'm going to explain a bit more about that, why there's 3 Western European countries. So the thing about the Security Council that makes it one of the main organs and one of the most important ones is that it's the only organ in the UN which can do binding decisions. So this is called resolutions, which is so they're the only country organ that can go above countries' national law. And for such a decision to be made, there needs to be 9 out of 15 that vote yes for for the resolution. And there has to be no permanent member, none of the P5, which is China, Russia, the US, Great Britain, and France. So none of those 5 countries are allowed to vote no, because if they vote no, that means that's it. There's no resolution, because they've got the veto vote. So they can veto any decision. So if a resolution, a binding decision is vetoed, then instead the Security Council can bring out a presidential statement instead. This is not a binding decision, but it's still quite a strong, decisive decision that shows the world what the Security Council thinks about a certain question, but it doesn't go above a country's national law. So this is the monthly schedule for the Security Council. I'm not expecting that anyone should read what it says, but I just want to show you that this is what's crammed into the Security Council's month of work. There's meetings almost every single day, and there's all these different kinds of meetings. So for example, we got briefings. Briefings can be on geographic or thematic questions, and it's when one or several people within a certain area comes to speak to the council and give them updates about the questions and tell them about things that they think that the Security Council should know to be able to make a decision on the situation or the question. And then that means that the Security Council can actually make a decision after it, which is based on facts, which is based on knowledge from the ground, rather than just from what they know before going into the Security Council. Other than that, there's also open debates, and that's where they motivate how they stand in certain questions. So that's more like all the countries sit down and they make a statement about how they motivate standing against or for certain resolutions or certain questions. And opposed to open debate, there could be closed consultations, which is a bit more like, it's behind closed doors. It's if the council wants to speak about more private, sensitive questions, and they don't have to motivate, and they don't have to prepare statements, which they have to do in the open debate, but they can rather just have a discussion. And usually this is because they think that in a closed consultation, there's more chance that this question is going to move forward and they're going to see a result. Because a lot of times in an open debate, there might be it might be too sensitive to actually state why a country thinks a certain way, or there's too much disagreement, so they want to actually have a more loose discussion to get forward between certain countries. So other than that, we also got, like, as told you, there was presidential statements. There's also daily press statements, which is also, that's like below the presidential statements, but it's also a way for the Security Council to actually push what they think forward to the media, to the world. Another thing that also sometimes ends up on the schedule is something called the Security Council missions, which then a few times a year the council will travel to certain areas to get closer to the ground, see what's happening. They're getting briefings in the actual country where they're traveling. So for example, in October 2017, they're in Sahel, and during April, May 2018, they went to Bangladesh and Myanmar to see the situation there. Let's see, so I'm gonna move on here. So what is the tools for the Security Council? So the thing about the Security Council, their mandates are all in the UN chapter, charter, UN charter. So that's the UN rulebook. We've got chapter 6, 7 and 8, which is then the tools for the Security Council and what they can work with. So the goal for the Security Council is that anytime they meet, they want to get forward, they want to move forward, they want to find a solution to the problems they're discussing. They want to move towards something, they want to move towards peace and security. So to do this, the main priority is always to find a peaceful solution to the problem. So number one is you go into chapter 6 to find a peaceful solution. So the different things that you can do is the UN Security Council can send mediators, they can make statements, they can condemn certain aspects, and they also have the power to show the world what is a problem. They shed a light on certain situations. If the Security Council speaks about something, then the world knows it. That's the spotlight that the Security Council wants to shed on certain conflicts and certain thematic questions as well. So this is something that it's the first step for the Security Council, but obviously not always. There's not always solutions coming from these peaceful peaceful work. So instead, as the next step, they have to go into chapter 7, and chapter 7 is then forcible. Forcible. Sorry, that's my translation starting to catch up with me. But they can use force instead, and then first and foremost they can use sanctions. So there's different kinds of sanctions. You can sanction a specific person. So for example, a leader of a country. That's something that the world doesn't agree with, Security Council doesn't agree with. That person can be pointed out and sanctioned. All their money can be frozen, their bank accounts frozen, their visas frozen. Like they can't travel anywhere, they can't go anywhere. That person then is forced to cooperate with the Security Council or the government or their country, depending on what the situation is. But you can also sanction a full state. So for example, we've got North Korea, we've got nuclear weapons. The Security Council decides that to make these nuclear testings in North Korea go away, you sanction North Korea. You can sanction by freeze all their assets, freeze trade. They can't trade with fabric, they can't trade with energy, oil, all of that goes away. That's the sanction from the Security Council through a resolution. So it's binding to all countries. They can't trade with North Korea. So usually, you don't have to go that far that the sanctions actually go through, because usually even the threat of a sanction to a state makes the state back off, take a step back to just and say, we'll stop the nuclear testing then. And then something that something to use force as well is usually there's usually talked about military solutions. So for example, we've got the peacekeepers. So peacekeepers, they aren't actually within the mandate, I don't think. But so the peacekeeping has been going on for about 20 years, and for the last 20 years, this peacekeeping it's been developing. So it used to be just peacekeeping, just keeping the peace in the country where they went, but it's slowly been more and more mandates added. For example, we've got Mali. In Mali, the peacekeepers are also allowed to protect cultural buildings. They protect culture because that's one of the main targets of the rebels in Mali, which means that needs protection, and that mandate has been given to the peacekeepers rather than anything other. So that's like slowly, peacekeepers get more and more to do, pretty much. And that's also something that's been a bit controversial in certain aspects. So the last chapter, the last tool of the Security Council is regional agreements. So for example, we got NATO, we've got the African Union. The Security Council can make agreements with these regional organizations and then have them do certain things. Like for example, NATO had an agreement when it came to Libya, for example. And the African Union had a military agreement when it came to Somalia. So let's see, now over to why we're actually here, Sweden in the Security Council. What has Sweden done during these 2 years that they've been in the Security Council? So the thing is, Sweden isn't really a big country. We're not a lot of people, we're not very big, but we are what we call a big UN country. So how's that? Well, we've been giving a lot of money to the UN. We've spent a lot of money trying to get the UN forward. Historically, we've also given a lot of UN soldiers. A lot of peacekeepers came from Sweden. And we also have to thank certain individuals. For example, Dag Hammarskjöld, which was the second Secretary General and the youngest Secretary General. We've got Hans Blix, which was the first chairman of, let's see if I can translate this. So, what's it? He was the first chairman of a commission, inspection commission. So the first UN inspection commission chairman. Then we also got Eliasson. So Jan Eliasson, he was the what's it called, Deputy Secretary General to Kofi Annan. And actually, once when I was talking about Jan Eliasson and saying Kofi Annan, someone pointed out to me that we could also take a bit of credit for Kofi Annan because his wife was Swedish, and he did have a summer house in Blekinge, so that's like, you know, close enough. Which I'm totally happy with because I think Kofi Annan is brilliant. He's done a lot of amazing things, so yeah, let's take credit for him as well. So the thing that Sweden then done was we wanted to show that if we're in the Security Council, we won't be, we won't use our ego in any way. We'll just work for a better planet, a better world. We will be driving something with substance, and it will have meaning, what we're working on in the Security Council. And, well, it worked. So Sweden has, as I said, we are a big UN country, and that was even more so shown because to get in to the Security Council, you need to be voted in from the General Assembly. And the thing is, you need 128 votes, and Sweden got 134. So the thing is, we competed against the Netherlands and Italy. So there's 3 countries for 2 spaces. Sweden was voted in the first round, and then the Netherlands and Italy, they kept competing to see which one of them would get the second chair. Netherlands got 125 votes, Italy 113. None of them got, it didn't matter, they done a couple of votes. None of them got to 128. So in the end, they decided to split the mandate. So Netherlands had 1 year, Italy 1 year. So that shows how So Sweden was quite happy with that. It shows how well liked, how much confidence the world has in Sweden working in the UN. This choice of Sweden as a Security Council member was very well received, and us at the UN Association, we thought that was a really, really good thing. We were really happy about because the thing about being in the Security Council, it's one of the places where you can push your questions, your country's questions, in the highest forum. It's the forum with the most, like, the best profile. It's the best place to do it, and it sets a unique possibility for Sweden to actually make a change in the world. So Sweden went to work quite straight away, half a year preparations to come before they came into the Security Council. The thing about when they started was that they were their first month, they were the president. So they were the ones who set the daily agenda for the Security Council the first month they were there. So they sat for half a year and done something called backbenching. So they were like sitting along in Security Council, seeing how everything is working, what's everyone doing. They started setting up channels between New York and Stockholm to quickly get information back and forth. They sent more people to work in New York and expanded the offices there to make sure that everything was covered. And they set up something called bottenplattan. So this is like the ground from where Sweden wanted to work upwards. So these were the 4 pillars that Sweden decided these are where we're going to build all our efforts from. So that's international humanitarian law, human rights, equality, and a humanitarian perspective. So those 4 questions were the 4 ones that were going to set the standard for every single question that Sweden wanted to work with. So from these ground pillars, Sweden pointed out 3 thematical questions that Sweden wanted to work extra much with. First one is conflict resolution. Second one is the resolution 1325 about women, peace and security. And third one was transparency and effectivity. So I'm going to go into talking a little bit about what these 3 thematic questions meant for Sweden during these 2 years. So conflict resolution, first of all. In 2017, the Foreign Ministry released a new campaign. This campaign was called #NoNewNames, and it meant that we don't want another conflict, another catastrophe that the UN can't prevent, can't stop, can't work against. So, for example, we got a few names that everyone knows. We got Rwanda, 94. We got Srebrenica, 95. We've got Aleppo, 2016. We got Yemen, 2014. And what the Foreign Ministry wanted with this campaign is saying, we don't want another one of those names. We don't want to build to the conflicts of the world where you say a name of a country or a area, a city, and you say a number and everyone knows what it means. Everyone knows that that's a genocide that happened there. Everyone knows how horrible this place was at this time. And that was something that we have to work against. And this is what Sweden took into the Security Council. And to do this, Sweden pushed for Chapter 6, peaceful solutions. But they also pushed for something that was that it has been mentioned by a lot, for example, by the Secretary General, and that is early warning, early action. To get there, we need dialogue, we need peaceful, You need to sit down and peacefully speak about how to get somewhere, and you have to cooperate with the Secretary General and his special representatives to the different conflicts and to the different thematic questions. So Sweden was working really hard during their presidential months to set up a political support for the Secretary General, to push that for him and his special representatives in these different questions to have as much support as possible from the Security Council. So with this early warning, early action, so there's a framework that you can work from that sets up different warning signs, and you can see that there's certain small things that if this exists in a country, that's a warning sign that something really horrible may happen. And that's the thing that usually the Security Council finds out what is happening before it's actually a conflict. But it's not a sure thing that something's going to happen. But for example, in Myanmar, there were early warning signs that something could happen. And now they've decided, there's a report deciding that that was a genocide. But years before that genocide happened, there were early warning signs. But when there's early warning signs, there also needs to be early action to stop the dreadful thing from happening. And that's something that Sweden has been working a lot with, and the Secretary General as well. He released a report on this specific issue. So, yeah, so that's like the conflict prevention. Also, one thing that Sweden's done in a more concrete way is that Sweden has been lifting the new security threat of climate insecurity. So, let's see here, so I'm saying, yes, so Sweden helped arranging a, a discussion in the Security Council about climate insecurity, and this was the first time since 2011 that question had been taken up in the Security Council, which is quite, if you look at the media today, you look at how much people are talking about the climate as a problem, as a security threat, how scary it is. And the Security Council hasn't taken it up since 2011. That's quite an interesting thing. But yeah, so that's the first issue that Sweden has been working a lot with and done a lot of work around. The second is women, peace and security. So you might remember that Sweden were talking about something called the feminist, to work with a feminist politics, foreign politics. And it's like a lot, I remember a lot of people were asking, what does that mean? What is that? How are they going to work with a feminist foreign policy? So I'm going to explain a lot of things that Sweden has done that could be included in this feminist policy. So 18 years ago, it's probably the most famous resolution, Resolution 1325, Women, Peace and Security. This was the first time that women were seen as actors in a conflict. They were seen as a part of it, rather than just the victims. And that's quite interesting because women are 51% of the world. So if you want peace, can you really exclude half of the population? Not really. So this is like really amazing that this resolution came to be, and it pushed for women to be included in peace processes. There's still mostly men sitting in the Security Council talking about peace, working for peace, but there is an actual work to get more women involved. And this is something that Sweden has been working a lot. They've been talking about making it happen rather than just talking about it. Implement, not just discuss. And a few things that Sweden has done with this is to push for women to get more influence and to work more, have a more solid work on getting women involved. And one of the very obvious things that Sweden has done with this is, so Sweden has been the president of the Security Council twice. And the second time, they made an effort to invite briefers that were women. And for the first time ever, there were 50% female briefers in the Security Council and 50% male. So that's the first time that there's equal. Every other time, there's been more men than women briefing the Security Council. So that's quite a big step to get women into the peace process. And that's quite amazing. And another thing that Sweden's pushed for is, so in all the resolutions, there's Sweden push for there to be writings about women, specifically pushing to get women into every resolution. In some way, they need to be included in these binding decisions. They need to be acknowledged. So yeah, a feminist foreign politics, actually, it can give results. Third, transparency and effectivity. So what Sweden wanted to do is include more people in this work. The Security Council and the UN in general has long been, they've for a long time gotten criticism that they're not transparent enough. You don't know what's happening. It's like they are the leading organ, but they're up there and we're down here and we have no idea what they're doing. So Sweden has been working a lot to change that. One thing that I personally think is really good is on their website they've been putting out statements about what they've been doing in the Security Council. So that's quite a good step. They've also been really good at using Facebook, Twitter, social media to push what they're talking about and to get it out there. So that's also quite a good thing. But more in the actual Security Council work, how they've opened up the debate and how they've worked to include more. For example, if we look at the situation in Yemen, the conflict there, one of the things that Sweden has been talking a lot about is to include Yemen. So if you're talking about the conflict, maybe you should invite the country where the conflict is happening. For example, imagine Sweden ends up going to war, right? The Security Council decides to take up this question, but they don't invite us, which means that, in my mind, the first thing I think is Trump, Putin, and Theresa May. They're sitting up there and they're deciding what's going to happen with our war. They're deciding how we're going to get peace. And that's a little bit scary. And therefore, I understand that Sweden would push for Yemen to actually be included in the discussions about Yemen, because how are you otherwise supposed to know what's actually going on the ground and what's actually happening? Because the UN can send special envoys who go down and see on the ground what's happening, they speak to people, and they come back and debrief the council. And that's amazing that they go there and they're specifically looking for what's wrong. But if you ask someone who's been living there for the last 10 years, who knows what's been happening, then that sheds a completely different light on the situation. It sheds a different light on the conflict and how to solve it. Another thing that Sweden has been trying to include is the elected 10 members' influence in the council. So the thing is, the permanent 5 obviously have more power in the Security Council. The elected 10, they're only there for 2 years. they only work for 2 years with these questions. They probably work around the questions before and after as well, but it's centered in the Security Council for 2 years, which means the permanent 5 might discuss things, just the 5 of them, make a decision, come in, ask the elected 10, do you support this? So one of the things that Sweden's been working on is trying to get the 10 elected members together, have them agree on things, and work together to get more influence in the Security Council. Because, as I said earlier, you need 9 out of 15. 9 votes yes to get a resolution through. The 5 permanent members, they can't get a resolution through themselves. They need 4 more countries. So if the elected 10 go together and they work together, then they have power as well. It's not only the permanent 5. So Sweden has been working a lot on getting the elected to be able to be at the negotiations table and help out. Also, the civil society has also been more included. So, for example, the briefers who usually come in might be more official people from countries. It might be more official people who work within the UN, who's been sent there, special representatives. But Sweden has worked a lot with including the civil society, inviting civil society to have a point of view. People who work, like, for example, if there's a question about women, peace and security, taking women who works in a conflict area with helping women, then that's a way to see how to work with women in the conflict area, because that's their job, that's what they're doing. So then you get a completely new point of view. You get a better picture of the situation, and you can you can draft a resolution with a more well-founded ground, more well-founded information, because you've actually heard it from someone who's been working with it on the ground. So this transparency and the effectivity, this is the third pillar that Sweden's been working specifically with in the Security Council as one of the main issues. So there. But of course, these 3 questions aren't the only ones that Sweden's been working with. Sweden's been working with every single question that the Security Council takes up, because the Security Council obviously takes up questions depending on what's happening in the world. If there is a situation in the world, that's the question that they take up. So Sweden hasn't been like, oh, there's a situation in Syria right now, but we prioritize transparency, so we're going to talk about this instead. They work with every single question. So for example, one of the things that has been other priorities is children in armed conflict. So every country, all the countries, they can be pen holders or chairmen for certain specific thematic questions. So for example, the pen holder for the Yemen conflict is Great Britain, and the chairman for children in armed conflict is Sweden. So our Prime Minister, he went and held a high-level meeting about children in armed conflict, which was called Protecting Children Today Prevents Conflict Tomorrow. And during this meeting, Sweden put out a resolution that was unanimously voted through. So this is one of the points where Sweden has successfully put through a resolution as its chairman in a priority of theirs. So that's a big success. Another place where they've been working a lot is humanitarian help to Syria. So together with one of the other elected 10 members, Kuwait, Sweden has pushed through to get more humanitarian help to Syria. They've been pushing for the neighboring countries to open their borders to get through supplies for the civil society in Syria. and in a lot of ways they've been quite successful in this. It's like there's still obviously a lot of controversy and a lot of disagreement when it comes to the weapons and the attacks, but the humanitarian help, the negotiations that Sweden and Kuwait has been pushing for have actually bore fruits. It's actually been very helpful for the civilians in Syria. And the last one here, Rohingyas in Myanmar. So I spoke a little bit about it earlier, but so in Myanmar, there's the UN has decided in a report that this is a genocide. So in Myanmar, the Rohingya Muslim minority has been attacked and driven out of Myanmar into Bangladesh by the military. And there's a lot of witness reports saying that women's been sexually abused, they've been raped to death, they've been burned alive, children have been thrown into fires, thrown into the river to drown, and men's been shot or beaten to death. And about an estimated 700,000 people have been driven into Bangladesh. And I think that's in total is about 900,000 people estimated living in Bangladesh now. That's about 90% of the Rohingya population that used to live in Myanmar that's been driven out or killed. And this has been a huge priority for Sweden. For example, Sweden has been pushing for the authorities in Myanmar to be taken to the International Criminal Court. They've been suggesting putting it out there. They've not pushed it hard enough, according to us at the UN Association. They could have pushed it more, but that is one of the points that they've been making and one of the priorities, because it is a current and very dreadful situation. So generally, I'm going to start talking a little bit about us at the UN Association and what we think about Sweden's work. And generally, we are really positive to the work that Sweden's put into the Security Council. Generally, we think they've had really good priorities in the UN Association. We have been pushing a lot for Myanmar, and we've been pushing a lot for certain different questions, and we do think for conflict prevention, we've been pushing for women, peace and security as well. So we are really happy with these being the 3 pillars that Sweden has put all their work on. However, there's also some criticism, and we do think that there's a couple of questions that we think that Sweden could have worked more with. 3 of these are the responsibility to protect, the veto situations, and the UN military peacekeeping operations. And we also do see some potential to work more when it comes to the 3 pillars, the 3 priorities that Sweden already had. For example, when it comes to Myanmar, we would have wanted them to push more for taking the authorities to the ICC. When it comes to transparency, we do think that they should have used a lot of more tougher words, tougher statements put out to the press, and to shed more light on the situations, because sometimes there's a bit too much private consultations, and we don't really know what's happening behind the closed doors. When it comes to, for example, conflict prevention, one of the things is the responsibility to protect that I'm going to talk a little bit more about now. So the responsibility to protect, it comes out of, so after the Second World War, we got the UN, right? And when the UN Charter was written in 1945, conflict and war, it's between two states. A war is between one state and another. It's not within it's not within one state. And then as the world's progressed, there was a problem with handling the modern conflict, which is an internal conflict. It's civil war. All of a sudden, the way that the UN worked, the UN Charter, it's not built for stopping an internal conflict, because we have something called, sovereignty, the principle of sovereignty. So the principle of sovereignty means that the UN are not allowed to go into internal business. The state has their own internal business, and that's theirs. The UN, other countries are not supposed to touch that. And this principle was in the UN Charter. So how is the UN supposed to help out? Because this means that a state is actually allowed to do horrific things to their own population, and the UN are not allowed to help out because there's the principle of sovereignty, which makes them torturing their own population. That's within that internal, in their internal business. So what was created was the responsibility to protect. 2005, I was, let's see. Well, I'm pretty sure that Kofi Annan had a lot to do with this, so I just wanted to give him a bit of credit in Sweden. So the 2005 RTP, it's responsibility to protect from genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnical cleansing. These 4 horrific crimes are so horrific that the principle of sovereignty can be breached by the responsibility to protect. This was what was decided, and it had the full support of the world, of all countries. So it was the World Summit in 2005, and all countries stood behind, all the member states stood behind this responsibility to act in conflict. And in 2009, this was set up into 3 different steps, or 3 pillars. So pillar 1 means that every state has the responsibility to protect their own population. Pillar 2 is that if the state is unable to protect their own population, they can ask for help, and the UN and all the world's countries have to help. They are obliged to help the population, the state. Pillar 3 is if the state is unable or unwilling to help, then the UN, all the world's countries, have to step in to protect the civilians against their own state. So that's like, so the 3 pillars, you go through the 3 different, and this is to also still protect the principle of sovereignty. It still gives the state the possibility to not be forced into having other states go into their internal business, because they still have the possibility to protect their own population. And they can still ask for help rather than just have someone go in. So the thing is, it's been working twice, Kenya and Côte d'Ivoire. Sorry, my French is really, really bad. And so in Kenya, the Security Council quickly stepped in when 2 ethnic groups when it became violent between two ethnic groups in the presidential elections in 2007, France came with the initiative to get Kofi Annan to go there and have peaceful mediation, and it was successful. So this is in Kenya. It was a successful prevention of a big conflict, thanks to mediation and thanks to responsibility to protect. And the Ivory Coast, I'm just going to go with that, sorry. In the election there, the president who lost decided to stay in his seat. And this led to a lot of demonstrations, and the president decided to let the military go against these demonstrators, the protesters. And there was already at this point, because they knew that this election was a bit rocky. There was possibility. There were warning signs that it wasn't going to go well, which then meant that there was already a peacekeeping operation in place. So the Security Council decided to let these peacekeeping operations get a mandate to use military, use weapons and military means to protect civilians. And in this case, that also led to preventing a full-scale conflict, because the peacekeepers protected civilians from being slaughtered by the president's military. And also, after that, the president was taken to the International Criminal Court. So that was also a very so-called successful. But so why, if this is a successful principle, then why do we think that this needs to be pushed? Well, it's because these days it's lacking in implementation. We've got Syria, we've got Yemen. Where is the responsibility to protect? Why don't we have more people on the ground protecting civilians? Because we hear about, in Yemen, it's the world's greatest humanitarian crisis. 40 school bus children were bombed to death in August in Yemen. So where is the responsibility to protect? Well, following the situation in Libya, NATO was sent in by the Security Council, and they attacked a convoy, which where the leader of Libya, Gaddafi, was in, and he ended up being killed by rebels. The reason NATO was allowed in was the responsibility to protect. They were there to protect civilians. And this led to China and Russia, mainly, the two of the permanent members. They saw a red flag, because all of a sudden, the responsibility to protect means that a country can go into a conflict and they can change the government. They can overthrow the government by using this principle. So all of a sudden, this was a principle that you can use as a cover. You can say, oh, I'm just going in to protect the civilians, but actually my plan is to get rid of the president and get a new government in. So Russia and China are both against this principle being used, and they're both veto countries, which means they can say no to any resolution that has to do with the responsibility to protect. However, we think that this is terrible, that you don't implement and you don't even mention this principle, because it is the principle that we can use to actually stop conflict. It is the principle where we can actually make a change for civilians. So we do think that this principle can't just be left and forgotten. It needs to be brought up, it needs to be mentioned. Even though it might be vetoed, it needs to be set on the international stage and be shed light on. Second, speaking of the veto, this is one of the points that we think that it should be pushed more. It's really difficult to get rid of the veto, because imagine you ask for a resolution on getting rid of the veto. How many countries do you think would probably veto that? But so there's a historical necessity of the veto, because after World War II, the 5 permanent countries needed more power. They were the big countries. They just won the war, and as that they would get a reward. So a reward was being permanent 5 and getting the right to veto any decision to protect. This was to protect their own country, to protect their own interests. However, right now, the veto you might not be able to get rid of the veto, to take it away completely. However, there are initiatives working on trying to restrain the veto, to make it used less often. So there's two initiatives, and about 120 states are behind both these initiatives in the UN. And as you see here, the French-Mexican initiative, which means France is behind it. And France is one of the permanent members. So there's actually 2 of the permanent 5 that are behind these initiatives. We've got France and we've got the UK. Both of them are actually behind this. China, US, Russia, maybe not so much. Sweden is also behind these. Let's see what I was supposed to say. So, for example, so what does it mean to restrain the veto? Well, for example, one of the initiatives states that if a resolution is regarding one of the 4 main crimes, one of the 4 horrific crimes, if the resolution is going to be about genocide, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, or war crimes, then you're not allowed to veto it. Because that could be a way to restrain it. You can restrain it, like you can veto any other question, sanctions and stuff like that, but these 4 crimes are too sensitive, they're too horrific to have someone veto them. So that's a suggestion. It's also suggested that they need to motivate. So if they put in a veto, they need to motivate why did we put in a veto. They can't just put it in and then not say anything. For example, it can be, there's a couple of vetoes put in that would be really hard for a country to actually motivate, to actually explain why they put it in. So one of the reasons as well, one of the things that we think Sweden should have done better is that if there is a risk for a veto to put in, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't put in a suggestion. Just because you know Russia and China are going to veto a question about Syria, or you know that they're going to veto a question about R2P, that doesn't mean that you should back off. You should still state the difficult question and push for them. So let's see, I'm running out of time. So I'm just really quickly going to go through this last point of ours. So the thing is about its military initiatives, peacekeeping operations. This is almost always on the monthly schedule of the Security Council, because the world keeps changing, and as I said earlier, in Mali, peacekeeping operations are now allowed to protect cultural heritage buildings, which then is a new mandate. There's an added responsibility. And every assignment they get, it's a new challenge in today's conflicts, and it's more complex. It gets more and more complex what these peacekeeping operations have to do and what they're responsible for. So one of the things is this HIPAA report. which is something that we, from the UN Association, we agree with these points that they've been putting out. These 4 recommendations are certain ones that we at the UN associations are also pushing for. So one is that we need more forceful instruments. You need to force peace. There needs to be a mandate to actually forcefully get peace to happen. Another thing is a quicker force, a quicker military. So if there's a conflict today, it takes between 6 and 18 months for peacekeeping operation, for the military peacekeeping operations to actually get to the conflict. So after about 6 months, that's a lot of dead civilians. That's a lot of ruined cities. That's a lot of suffering. For example, in Yemen, in August this year, it was the highest ever month with the highest civilian death count from fighting, not from starvation, but from fighting. I think it was about 900 people, civilians, who died in fights. 900 civilians in 1 month. Then think about that for 6 months. So one of the things that needs to happen is some sort of military force that can quickly get sent to a conflict area within weeks to protect civilians. And that's the second one, to protect civilians. The mandate to protect civilians needs to be better. The personnel needs to be better trained in what that means. For example, in South Sudan in 2016, civilians were too far out of the area where the peacekeeping operations were allowed to protect them. So the peacekeepers actually heard the civilians cry for help, but they weren't allowed to go there. However, the mandate, it's unclear what they're actually allowed to do and not. So more education and more resources when it comes to protecting civilians is something that is needed for peacekeeping operations. Also, there's too few countries that aren't providing with UN peacekeepers. There should be more countries providing soldiers, and there should be more countries providing with money. For example, I've got a number here, which is the budget for peacekeeping operations, which is 7.3 billion US dollars for 1 year, which means 0.5% of the total military expense in the world. So that 0.5 of the money goes for peacekeeping operations. The rest is military operations. So that's a number which then points at more international responsibility, more money to peacekeeping operations. And that was my last slide and the last thing I'm going to tell you about. Thank you. Anyone got any questions? No, everything's crystal clear. Yeah. All right, yeah. I've got nothing more to say then. Thank you.
Tack så mycket, Molly.
Tack.
Det var